The last morning of the year settled gently over Martha Whitaker's farmhouse, the kind of soft Midwestern winter morning that seemed to hold its breath. At 82, she moved slowly now, but there was nothing frail about the way she inhabited her home. The place responded to her presence, as if every board and beam still remembered the hands that built it. Warm air drifted through the hallway from the old cast-iron stove in the living room, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke. From the kitchen came the sweeter, softer aromas of rising dough and cinnamon, and from the corner of the front room, the pine of the Christmas tree lingered, mixing with the quiet in a way that felt almost like a heartbeat. Martha paused beside the dining table, resting one hand on its edge. The house had always had two lives, two personalities, and she felt the difference in her bones. There was the version that existed now, peaceful, still gentle, the version where she heard her thoughts clearly, where the clock ticked in long, even breaths, and where she could wander from room to room without rushing. In this version, the farmhouse felt like a companion. It listened, it steadied her, it remembered her. And then there was the other version, the one that would arrive soon enough. Loud, chaotic, filled with stomping boots and voices that bounced off the walls, with doors slamming and music turned up too high, with demands made not out of malice but out of habit, a version where she became a shadow of herself amid the noise. That part of the house she never looked forward to, though she endured it every holiday. She drifted toward the window over the kitchen sink and looked out at the broad Iowa fields, frozen beneath a thin layer of snow. The sky was pale, almost silver, a winter color that always made her think of the past more than the future. She could still picture her late husband, Robert, out there decades ago, setting posts for the fence line, measuring planks, laughing at his own clumsy jokes as they worked side by side. They had built this house slowly, board by board, paycheck by paycheck, treating every improvement like a milestone. Robert had always said a home built by hand kept the memories inside its walls longer. She stepped into the living room and brushed her fingertips along the mantel Robert installed himself. The wood had darkened with age, but she could still see the grain he sanded smooth one July afternoon when the two of them were younger and sunburned and entirely certain that life was something they could shape with their own will. This was the quiet version of the house, the one that belonged wholly to her. A calm she knew would not survive the afternoon. But for now, for these few late morning hours on December 31st, she allowed herself to savor every second of it, knowing the storm of family noise was already on its way. By early afternoon, the quiet rhythm of Martha's day had shifted into the familiar motion of work, a kind of holiday choreography she had perfected over the years. She moved through the kitchen slowly, but with purpose, lifting pans, checking timers, tasting broths, adjusting seasonings. On the counter sat a fully thawed roast turkey, rubbed with butter and herbs the way her mother taught her. 2 casseroles were in the oven, 1 green bean, 1 cheesy potato, both bubbling gently beneath foil. A pair of pies cooled by the window, 1 pumpkin, 1 apple. Bowls of salad waited on the sideboard. 16 people required a small feast, and Martha had always believed in preparing more food than anyone could possibly eat. The kitchen smelled like every December holiday she'd ever hosted: rosemary, nutmeg, roasted onions, the sweetness of baked apples. She worked alone in the warm glow of the stove, and for a few moments, she let herself pretend this was simply another family tradition everyone appreciated. But the memory that had been pressing at her chest for days did not allow her to drift too far into nostalgia. It had happened 3 days earlier, on a cold Tuesday afternoon. She had stepped out to the back porch to bring in a stack of firewood. Jessica's voice floated around the corner, the sharp, carefree tone she used when she didn't think anyone was listening. Martha paused, out of sight, and heard her daughter-in-law laugh into the phone. "Of course we're going out there for New Year's," Jessica said. "It's basically a free hotel with homemade food." The old lady already has everything set up. The old lady. Not Martha. Not Mom. Not even her name. Just a role. A convenience. A place where you didn't have to book a room or cook a single dish. Martha had stood there for several seconds, her arms wrapped around the stack of firewood, the cold air biting her hands. She didn't say a word. She didn't step forward. She simply turned and walked back inside, closing the door softly so Jessica wouldn't notice. She chose silence, not because she agreed, not because it didn't hurt, but because of Emily. Sweet, 17-year-old Emily, who always hugged her first and asked how her garden survived the frost. Emily needed a calm holiday, not another argument between her parents and her grandmother. So Martha kept the phone call tucked away like an old bruise beneath her sweater. She kneaded dough, basted turkey, and sliced apples with steady hands, carrying the weight of those thoughtless words quietly. Hurt, yes, but held beneath layers of long-practiced acceptance, exactly the way she had done for years. By late afternoon, the stillness inside Martha's farmhouse had thinned to a fragile thread. She had just finished arranging the casseroles on the counter when she heard the crunch of tires over frozen gravel, followed by the slam of car doors. A rush of winter air forced its way inside as the front door swung open. Aaron came in first, stamping snow from his boots, already talking loudly on the phone. Jessica followed, close behind, balancing shopping bags and barking at him about where to put the gifts. Neither looked in Martha's direction. Neither offered a hug, a greeting, or even a gentle hello. They simply moved past her, blowing into the house like a gust that rearranged everything in its path. Behind them came cousins-in-laws, friends of in-laws, voices rising all at once, competing with the rustle of coats, the thud of boots, the clatter of bags hitting the hardwood floor. Someone laughed too loudly. Someone else complained about the drive from West Des Moines. A teenager asked for the Wi-Fi password before he even set his backpack down. Martha stood in the entryway for a moment, her hands folded together, as coats were tossed over the backs of chairs she had spent all morning dusting. Someone dropped a pair of wet gloves on her antique sideboard. A small child knocked over the decorative pine arrangement she had set on the foyer table. His mother didn't notice, or didn't care. "Where's the speaker? I told you to bring it." Jessica snapped at one of the cousins. "I did somewhere in the car." "Go look for it," he muttered back. The argument escalated immediately, loud enough to bounce through the hallway and into the living room. Within minutes, a pop playlist was blaring from someone's phone. Voices overlapped. Laughter spilled over itself. The quiet, careful world Martha had tended all morning evaporated under the noise. No one asked how she was. No one thanked her for the food. No one even looked up long enough to see the softness on her face replaced by a practiced smile. To them, she was simply part of the background, a piece of furniture that shifted out of the way when needed. Her invisibility settled in fully, like a familiar winter coat she never wanted but kept wearing anyway. Without comment, Martha turned and walked back toward the kitchen. The warm air wrapped around her as the door swung shut behind her, muffling the chaos into something distant and blurry. Here, among simmering pots and cooling pies, she could breathe. This small room was her refuge, her sanctuary. The storm had arrived, and just like every year, it had swallowed the quiet whole. By the time dinner was served, the farmhouse had become a whirl of overlapping voices and clattering dishes. The long dining table, covered earlier that day with Martha's best linen, now strained under the weight of platters and bowls. Roast turkey carved in generous slices, steaming casseroles, salads, rolls, and pies waiting near the end. It should have been a moment of pride, the culmination of hours of careful preparation. Instead, it was merely fuel for the commotion. Martha moved quietly around the table, carrying plates to the guests who didn't pause their conversations long enough to notice her. She refilled drinks before anyone asked. wiped up the butter someone smeared across the table, and slipped used utensils away to the kitchen to wash before the pile became overwhelming. Each time she returned, her presence barely registered. A cousin scooted his chair into her path without looking. Someone reached past her arm to grab salt. A spilled soda was pushed toward her side of the table with a casual, "Here? This is dripping," as if she were a busboy at a diner rather than the woman who owned the house. She finally took her place at the head of the table, a position meant to signify respect, but she felt like a placeholder, a prop arranged there to complete the picture. Conversations traveled down the table without ever coming her way. Stories about work, arguments about car trouble, jokes she couldn't hear over the noise. No one asked how she was feeling. No one asked whether she'd eaten. The plate in front of her stayed mostly untouched. Only Emily noticed. The 17-year-old sat halfway down the table, watching her grandmother the way a person watches a fragile object everyone else keeps bumping into. When Martha reached for a serving spoon and someone accidentally knocked her elbow, Emily's eyes snapped toward her with concern. When Martha returned from the kitchen with a tray of drinks, Emily was the only one who murmured a soft, "Thank you." It was a small mercy, but it settled around Martha like a tiny, flickering flame in the storm. Still, the noise pressed in on her. The laughter felt too loud, too sharp. The swirling movement of bodies, plates, hands, napkins overwhelming. Her house of quiet had become a crowded, boisterous room where she could barely hear her own thoughts. Her role was no longer mother or grandmother or host. She was simply the one who fetched, cleared, wiped, and filled. With every passing minute, the sense of being erased grew heavier, like an invisible weight tugging at her shoulders. She sat upright, smiled when she had to, and offered nods to fill the spaces where her voice should have been. But inside, she felt smaller and smaller, a fading outline in a home she no longer seemed to exist in. As dinner plates were pushed aside and the noise in the house reached its peak, Aaron rose from his chair with the swagger of someone who believed he was about to deliver the highlight of the evening. He clapped his hands loudly, cutting through the conversations. "All right, everyone," he called out, lifting his voice over the music and chatter. "Time for the main gift of the night." A few relatives cheered. Someone whistled. Jessica smirked knowingly. Martha, still seated at the head of the table, straightened instinctively. She folded her hands politely in her lap, unsure what he meant but willing, as always, to meet the moment with grace. Aaron reached behind his chair and dragged forward a long, awkwardly wrapped bundle. The paper was wrinkled and torn in places, taped hastily along the edges. He presented it with exaggerated importance, holding it upright for everyone to see. "For our wonderful hostess," he announced dramatically, "who keeps this place running year after year." The room hushed, but only for a second. People leaned in, expecting something sentimental or funny, something warm. Martha managed a small smile, keeping her posture poised. "Go ahead, Mom," Aaron urged loudly. "Open it." She peeled away the paper slowly. The plastic crinkled under her fingers. When the wrapping fell away, the object inside rolled across her lap with a dull thud. A cheap blue plastic mop, the kind sold in the clearance aisle at the local supermarket, its white cotton head already uneven, its handle scratched as if it had been tossed around before being wrapped. It looked startlingly out of place against her holiday tablecloth. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then Aaron laughed, sharp, triumphant, far too pleased with himself. "So you don't forget your place in this house," he declared, raising his voice as though delivering the punchline of a well-crafted joke. Laughter burst from several guests. Jessica giggled behind her hand, delighted. A cousin snorted. Someone else slapped the table, but the sound faded instantly for Martha. The room, just moments ago overwhelming with noise, fell into an eerie, muffled stillness. She didn't hear the laughter anymore. Not really. It washed around her as if she were underwater. Across the table, Emily's face drained of color. The girl stared at her father in disbelief, then at her grandmother with wide, horrified eyes. She didn't laugh. She didn't move. She looked as though someone had slapped her. Martha didn't reach for the mop. Her hands hovered just above it, frozen. Something inside her shifted, quietly, almost imperceptibly, but completely. It wasn't pain the way she understood it, not the stinging kind, not the kind that cracked open the heart. It was something else, a coldness, a settling, a final, heavy stillness she hadn't felt before. Not broken, no, not that, but hardened, solidifying like winter ice over a pond. She lifted her eyes to Aaron's expectant grin. He waited for her to join in the laughter, to blush, to pretend it was all harmless fun. Instead, she offered the smallest, strangest smile she'd ever worn, tight, controlled, unreadable, the kind that marked the end of something long overdue. For several long seconds, Martha didn't move. The dining room continued buzzing around her, chairs scraping, cousins laughing, Jessica whispering something smug into her sister's ear. But all of it felt far away, as if the walls of the farmhouse had suddenly thickened. The noise dulled into a soft, shapeless murmur. The only sound she could truly hear was a thin, high ringing in her ears, steady and piercing, cutting through everything else. She looked down at the mop lying across her lap. The plastic was cold against her palms, so bright, so cheap, so pointedly chosen. Her breath edged out in a slow, quiet sigh, the kind that didn't tremble, didn't quiver, didn't give anything away. But something had already shifted inside her, deep and irreversible. Humiliation didn't crash over her like a wave. It crystallized, clean and sharp, settling into a kind of calm she had never felt before. A clarity born not from anger, but from recognition. She had known, of course, known for years that Aaron saw her more as a resource than a mother, known that Jessica treated her home like a convenience, known that holiday visits came with expectations rather than affection. But until this moment, those truths had been softened by memory, by hope, by love. Now they stood in front of her, naked and unmistakable. Martha lifted her chin, letting the coldness spread through her chest. Not numbing, but clarifying. It was the kind of cold that steadies the hands, that straightens the spine, that sharpens the mind. The kind of cold that makes a person finally see what has been there all along. She rose slowly from her chair. Conversations faltered for a moment as people glanced her way, expecting a joke, a dismissive comment, perhaps a grateful smile to ease their guilt. Instead, she simply carried the mop across the room. Her steps were quiet, deliberate, measured. She reached the corner near the front door, placed the mop against the wall with meticulous care, and then smoothed the tablecloth as she walked back to her seat. The room gradually resumed its noise, as though everything were normal. But everything was not normal. Martha sat down, folding her hands gently in her lap, her expression calm, too calm. Emily watched her with worried eyes, sensing the difference, even if no one else did. Because something essential had clicked into place inside Martha Whitaker, something that had been waiting, dormant, patient. She was no longer the woman who absorbed slights without question, no longer the woman who confused sacrifice with love, no longer the woman who allowed herself to be erased in her own home. The switch had been thrown, quietly, finally, completely, as evening slipped into night. The energy around the farmhouse grew increasingly frantic. The music thumped louder, the conversations tangled into each other, and the guests, already loosened by wine and holiday excitement, moved with restless, chaotic momentum. Someone argued about which song to play next. Someone else shouted from the living room about finding the champagne glasses. The countdown wasn't even close, yet the house felt as if it were building toward an explosion. Through it all, Martha remained still. She sat at the far end of the dining table, hands folded neatly, her back straight, her expression composed in a way no one bothered to notice. The mop stood in its corner like a silent accusation, but Martha didn't look at it. She didn't need to. The cold clarity inside her had already done its work. She existed slightly apart from the room now, present in body, but no longer tethered to the noise, the demands, or the people who mistook her presence for service. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, its rhythm slicing cleanly through the chaos. Each tick felt like a reminder, a quiet drum marking the remaining minutes of a life she had lived too long, one of accommodation, of appeasement, of disappearing into the background for the sake of peace. When the clock chimed midnight, something in Martha's posture changed. Her shoulders lifted, almost imperceptibly, her spine lengthened, her breath deepened, steady and calm, not like someone bracing for a confrontation, but like someone stepping into a truth she had finally stopped avoiding. The noise around her grew louder, more careless. Jessica knocked over a glass and laughed. A cousin switched the music to something even more frantic. Aaron shouted an order for someone to check the champagne chilling on the porch, but none of it touched her. It all slid past her like wind slipping around the edges of a stone. 5 minutes to midnight, the guests gathered in the living room, clinking glasses, checking their phones for the countdown stream. Martha rose slowly, her movements deliberate, the same steadiness she had felt earlier now settling deeper into her bones. She walked toward the threshold of the dining room, pausing just before the others noticed her. She felt neither fear nor sadness, only a profound sense of finality, like closing a door that had never truly protected her. Tonight would not simply mark the end of a year. It would mark the end of the version of herself who accepted being overlooked, the version who mistook silence for peace, the version who believed love meant giving until nothing was left. Midnight was approaching, and with it, the beginning of her new life, one she would claim, not endure. The final seconds of the countdown burst through the living room like a firecracker, voices shouting numbers in uneven unison, glasses raised high, the television flashing bright with the New Year's celebration streaming from Times Square. When the room erupted with shouts of Happy New Year and the clinking of glasses, Aaron turned, flushed and triumphant, toward his mother. "All right, everyone," he called, waving his champagne flute. "Settle down. Mom should say a few words. She always gives the first toast of the year." He grinned at her with the confidence of a man who expected sentimentality, a soft blessing, maybe even gratitude. The family quieted, though the air still vibrated with leftover adrenaline. 16 faces turned toward Martha, some expectant, some bored, some mildly drunk. Emily watched her grandmother with cautious hope. Martha stepped forward. Her expression was serene, almost gentle, but her posture held a steadiness no one in the room had ever noticed before. She did not raise her glass immediately. She let the silence settle, let the cold clarity inside her anchor each word before it left her lips. "Happy New Year," she said calmly. Her voice carried across the room, not loud, but unmistakably firm. "I've decided to begin this year with some changes." A polite murmur rippled through the crowd. Aaron's smile widened, assuming this was leading into a sentimental monologue about family or health. Martha continued. "My first change," she said, turning her gaze directly toward her son, "is about finances." Aaron's smile twitched. "Mom, what?" "The money I've been sending you every month," she said evenly, "will stop. Effective today." The room froze. Jessica's head snapped toward Aaron. Someone gasped. A cousin choked on his drink. Only Emily remained completely still, eyes fixed on her grandmother with growing admiration. Aaron blinked, confused. "Mom, that's not funny." "It isn't a joke." Her voice was steady, almost gentle. "You and Jessica are both grown adults. I'm sure you'll find a way to manage without my support. Before anyone could speak, she continued, My second change is this. She paused, letting the weight land. I've been talking with a realtor in town. I intend to sell this property and move to a smaller apartment closer to medical services. Jessica's shriek cut through the room like a blade. Sell the house? Sell this house? Are you insane? This is my home, Martha interrupted softly, and I choose what happens to it. Erin's face drained of color. Mom, you can't just. This place is supposed to be. You have 2 weeks, she said, her tone unchanged, to collect any personal belongings you want to keep. After that, the house will be cleaned and prepared for listing. The room erupted. Voices shouted over each other. Jessica paced, her hands gripping her hair. Erin sputtered, trying to form sentences that wouldn't come. A cousin muttered, She can't be serious. Someone else asked if Martha had seen a doctor. The chaos grew loud, messy, frantic. But Martha stood unmoved in the center of it all. Calm, steady, untouched by the panic swirling around her. She had said what needed to be said, and the era of being taken for granted had ended with the stroke of midnight. The living room broke into chaos, so quickly it felt almost theatrical. One moment the family was frozen in stunned silence. The next, guests were tripping over each other to grab coats, muttering excuses, desperate to escape before being pulled into the Whitakers' meltdown. Within minutes, the front door swung open and shut in rapid succession as cars peeled out of the driveway, their tires spinning on the icy gravel. Inside, the shouting began. Erin rounded on Jessica first. Why did you have to push her? You always push her. Jessica threw her hands up. Oh, don't you dare blame this on me. She's your mother. You're the one who didn't manage her. Manage her. Erin's voice cracked. You treat her like a maid. Jess, you liked it just fine when the money showed up every month. She shot back, jabbing a finger into his chest. And now you're shocked, she snapped. Really? Their argument ricocheted through the house. Loud, frantic, ugly. They stormed down the hallway, slamming doors, flinging open drawers, arguing over what was theirs and what they should grab before Martha changed her mind again. Even in their panic, they couldn't stop fighting. This wasn't the deal. Jessica yelled from the guest room, stuffing clothes into a tote bag. There was no deal. Erin shouted back. She was doing us a favor. A favor. Jessica barked a laugh. Then why didn't you stop taking her money? Their desperation was a spectacle, raw, embarrassing, finally visible in the harsh overhead lights. They snatched up towels, toiletries, leftover food, even a box of cookies from the pantry. Anything not nailed down seemed suddenly essential. They stumbled over each other, cursing under their breaths, their frantic movements a stark contrast to the calm, quiet woman who stood watching from the hallway. Martha didn't intervene. She didn't soothe. She didn't apologize. Instead, she turned and walked slowly to her bedroom, closing the door with a soft click. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from something far stronger and more unfamiliar. Liberation. For the first time in years. She felt the air in her lungs expand fully. Her heartbeat steadied. Her shoulders loosened. She sat on the edge of her bed and let the distant shouting wash past her like a storm outside a sturdy window. Just before dawn, the house fell silent. When she stepped into the hallway, the guest rooms were empty, the driveway was bare, and the only evidence of the night's collapse was the trail of muddy footprints leading out the front door. Erin and Jessica were gone, and with them, the last remnants of the life she had allowed herself to be trapped in. The first morning after the meltdown was so quiet it almost felt unreal. Martha woke before sunrise, as she always did, and stepped into a house that finally sounded like itself again. No footsteps, no doors slamming, no voices cutting through the air. only the soft hum of the furnace and the faint creak of the old wooden floors adjusting to the cold. She brewed a cup of tea and carried it to the window overlooking the front yard. Snow drifted down in steady, delicate flakes, covering the muddy tracks left by her son and daughter-in-law. The fields beyond the fence shimmered white, untouched. The sight brought a stillness to her chest that she hadn't felt in years, an ease that spread slowly, warming her more than the tea in her hands. For the next 2 days, the house remained silent. Martha cooked simple meals, read by the fire, and slept deeply. She didn't rush. She didn't worry. She simply lived. Every hour felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. On the third afternoon, just as the sky began turning a pale winter blue, she heard the soft crunch of footsteps on the snow outside. Not hurried, not heavy, a gentle, precise rhythm. She opened the door before the knock landed. Emily stood there, a backpack slung over one shoulder, her cheeks flushed from the cold. A mix of determination and sorrow sat in her eyes. "Grandma," she said softly, "can I stay with you? Just for a little while." Martha stepped aside without hesitation, pulling her granddaughter into a warm embrace. Emily clung to her, breathing shakily against her shoulder. When they finally sat down at the kitchen table, Emily wrapped her fingers around a cup of hot cocoa Martha prepared for her, staring into the steam as though gathering her thoughts. "It's bad at home," she began. "Really bad. They're fighting all the time. Dad keeps saying you blindsided him. Mom keeps blaming him for everything. They're talking about money nonstop, about how they lost their chance." She lifted her eyes, glassy but steady. "They're acting like the house was theirs, like your money was theirs, like they were owed something." Martha listened quietly, her hands folded around her tea. Emily took a breath, then spoke the words she had clearly been carrying in her heart for days. "It was never theirs," she said gently. "It was always yours. Everything. This house. Your money. Your life." The truth of it landed softly, like the snow outside, quiet but undeniable. Martha reached across the table, resting her hand over Emily's. "You can stay as long as you need," she whispered. And in that moment, the house felt full again, not with noise or demands, but with something she had almost forgotten how to hold: love. With Emily settled in and the house finally returned to calm, Martha began to move through her days with a renewed sense of purpose. The quiet no longer felt like absence, it felt like space. Space to breathe, to think, to reclaim her home piece by piece. The first change she made was practical. For years she had been doing everything herself, shoveling snow, splitting firewood, mending small repairs, tasks that had become harder with age, but that she pushed through out of habit and necessity. Now, with the money she no longer sent to Aaron, she allowed herself something new: help. She called Tom Wheeler, the local handyman who had fixed her gutter 2 summers earlier. When he arrived, he greeted her with a firm handshake and a warmth that felt genuine. He looked around the property with the practiced eyes of a man who understood old farmhouses. "Let's start with the porch," he said. "These boards won't last another winter." Over the next 2 weeks, Tom rebuilt the porch, split a whole stack of firewood for the season, cleared the back path, and repaired the leaning section of the fence near the maple tree. He never treated her like a burden or an afterthought. He asked her opinion. He respected her decisions. He worked carefully, and when they talked, he listened, really listened. For the first time in a long time, Martha felt useful in her own home, not as a servant or a caretaker, but as a person whose voice mattered. The difference was subtle but profound. One evening, after Tom had finished replacing the last loose railing, Martha sat on the new porch steps, watching the sun slip below the snowy fields. Emily sat beside her, sketching the barn in her notebook. The piece of it all made something inside Martha feel alive again. That night, she made another decision she had been turning over quietly in her mind. She called her old friend, Linda Cooper, the woman she'd known since they were both young mothers, the one who had moved to Nebraska years ago after losing her husband. They hadn't lived close in a long time, but they had never lost touch. "Linda," Martha said gently, "how would you feel about coming to stay with me? For more than just a visit." There was a brief, stunned silence. Then Linda's voice softened with emotion. "I would love that, Martha. Truly." A month later, Linda moved in with 2 suitcases and a smile that reached her eyes. The house shifted instantly, not into chaos, but into warmth. 2 older women who had weathered the world in different ways found themselves building a new rhythm together. Emily adored her new roommate, and the 3 of them created a home defined not by noise or demands, but by companionship. The farmhouse felt alive again. Not loud, not crowded, simply alive. By the time spring softened into summer, the entire property seemed to exhale. The long winter thawed slowly, revealing earth that had waited patiently for warmth. Martha worked the garden with careful hands, turning soil, trimming back winter's remnants, planting small bursts of color wherever the ground felt ready to receive them. Weeks later, the yard erupted into life. The peonies were the first surprise. Jessica had planted them years ago and immediately forgotten about them, too impatient to tend flowers that needed time. But those hardy roots survived the neglect. Now, in the July sun, they bloomed in full, extravagant pinks and whites, their heavy heads bowing toward the ground as if acknowledging Martha alone. She knelt beside them one early morning, brushing a petal with her fingertip. Even abandoned things could flourish. There was a quiet lesson in that. Under the shade of the oak tree, Emily stood before a new easel, a gift Martha had saved up for and given her in late spring. The teenager painted with quiet focus, capturing the bright wildness of the garden in soft strokes of green, pink, and gold. Sometimes she hummed faintly. Sometimes she asked Martha questions about the colors. Mostly she simply worked, content and grounded in a way that felt miles away from the noise she had left behind at her parents' home. On the porch, Linda spent her mornings with a book and her afternoons with a glass of iced tea. She had slipped into the rhythm of the farmhouse as though she had always been part of it. Her laughter, warm and low and often spontaneous, became one of the house's new sounds, weaving through the rooms like second heartbeat. And then there was Tom. He visited every couple of weeks, claiming he needed to check on the repairs, though Martha suspected he enjoyed the company more than the work. He touched up a bit of paint on the barn, fixed a hinge on the back gate, and helped Linda carry heavy bags of soil for the garden. He always stayed for coffee, sometimes for dinner, always with the same steady presence that reassured more than it intruded. The mop, that cheap blue symbol of everything Martha had endured, was long gone. Tom had burned it in the fire pit on his very first afternoon there. He hadn't asked permission. He had simply found it leaning in the corner of the mudroom, understood immediately what it represented, and carried it outside without a word. Martha watched silently as the plastic melted and the cotton threads curled into ash. She didn't stop him. The flames felt like a cleansing. Now, on a warm golden evening, she stood in the heart of her garden, surrounded by blooms that swayed gently in the breeze. Emily painted near the porch. Linda called out a question about dinner. The air smelled of peonies and sun-warmed grass. The farmhouse behind her looked like it had regained its soul. Martha closed her eyes and breathed deeply. The mop had not been humiliation. It had been the key, the small, cruel spark that opened a door she had forgotten she was allowed to walk through. She opened her eyes and looked around at the quiet kingdom she had reclaimed. It was hers again, her life, her dignity, her home, and she intended to protect all of it, gently, fiercely, and without apology.